I come from a working class community, a rural working class community. And the thing that I will hear most frequently is, but am I not marginalized too for the
Mhm.
white working class? So
Yes.
how how would you address that question if you got it?
Yeah. I mean, it's a yes and we get it all the time, all the time. So we hear that question too. That it's, you do a categorization on race, but you're also marginalized in other ways. So even though that whiteness gives you a privilege to be unmarked, to move up in the world in a way that people don't question things like your competency. If Missy and I, we talk about this. If you have an accent from the South, you're going to be assumed to be dumb. But here's your white privilege. You can practice getting rid of that accent, and then people will never know you're from the South. Right. And that's the difference between me. No matter how much I try to get rid of my Mexican accent, I will still look very different. I'm not going to be able to fully assimilate and become invisible. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IntraCultural podcast. I am Lucy.
And I'm Alex.
And I'm Missy.
And we are three anthropologists that lead the firm Willing Observers, a firm made up of anthropologists who are fostering inclusion, equity, and change. And we are sponsored by us, the IntraCultural Strategy Certificate and InCDP certification programs. We do a certificate and a certification. So if you're interested in learning more and become more proficient in the DEIB, whether that's to help you in your career development or in your current profession, it's a really updated course where we're talking about and applying all the changes of DEI landscape into the program. And essentially the goal is that by the end, you'll get a certificate or a certification so you can learn how to create more inclusive cultures in your department, organization, university, you name it. And the main difference between the two programs is that one of them is gives you the foundations and the concepts, and the other one, we help you develop your own strategic plan. And there's additional more resources in a toolkit that comes with that. And what else? Let's say anything else I forgot about the programs, Missy?
No, you did a great commercial interlude though. So we don't need it's like we should have introduced it like the Intercultural Podcast, sponsored by ICS. I like it.
And I did not script that. That just came out of my head like that. So maybe I should go into marketing and
There you go.
Well, let's see. Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a 50% discount, a permanent discount for anyone that's been unemployed because of the Trump budget cuts. That no, because of Trump's anti-DEI executive orders.
Because of Trump's existence. If you are unemployed because of Trump's existence, although that would probably extend further now that we've had tariff week. So
that is totally fine. Come get a 50% discount. We support you no matter what discipline you're in.
So the Intercultural Podcast covers a range of topics. We answer common questions that can be better understood using the concept of culture. And but before we dive in today, how are you doing, Alex? What's going on?
I'm doing really good. It is Labor Day weekend. And for those of you who know Brooklyn, New York turns into pandemonium, it's when the Caribbean Day Parade happens. I live on Flatbush Avenue, so it's already cordoned off. There's going to be a whole lot of fetes, soca parties, limes. So it's going to be a good weekend. I'm looking forward to soaking up my Caribbean culture and enjoying the long weekend for sure.
That sounds wonderful. Lucy, what are you doing? Are you taking any time away from labor on Labor Day
Oh my
weekend?
God. As you know, I've been traveling so much. Missy and I went to Denmark a few weeks ago, and then I stayed in India for a couple of weeks. So I feel like my body just adjusted. So I noticed this morning that I did not use all my hotspot data. I'm in the wilderness with no Wi-Fi. I'm really excited to watch movies. like wild concept when you have no Wi-Fi. So I need to find what good movies to watch so I can watch them this weekend and waste all my hotspot data. That's my plan.
Excellent. Excellent. I think I am going to cook. We usually do the grilling thing on any weekend that we have any extra time. So we love to cook. My partner Eric and I that's what we do. So I'm gonna cook and eat and then just like lay over things after I eat too much. That's my plan.
That's really nice.
The itis. You gotta give your body that nice little rest after a good meal. There's nothing better than it.
Yes, absolutely.
Do I hear that we're all taking time off? Is that what I just heard?
Yes, I listened to the last podcast episode again and it was very inspirational. But
Good. Oh, that's right.
Small plug for our last episode.
Yes.
For sure.
And we just, Alex just led a resiliency training for a nonprofit organization in California, and that went so well. I think we should definitely take notes from the things that we teach. So thank you, Alex.
Thank you. It was a great time. It was a great time. I'm glad we got to talk more about resilience.
I feel like you've made such a big cultural impact in the firm since you've joined already in such a small amount of time. So I appreciate that too.
Oh, thank you. It's really good to be here. Yes.
Well,
okay.
Today, we are going to not focus on resilience, unfortunately, but maybe a bit. So we're going to look at a question that can be tricky for some people who are trying to engage in DEIB and social justice work, people who want to change society, people who want to move forward towards greater equity. And in doing that work, we often hear from white people that they don't want to step on anyone's toes, right? Or they don't know how to participate or what to do. And some white folks, and this is, myself included, have heard from marginalized groups that they're seeking to ally with they don't want me to be there, right? Or they don't want you to be there. So we're going to address all of these potential issues by answering the question today, why do we need white people to do this work?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And I'm glad, when Missy and I started Willing Observers, that was whiteness was one of the things that really we had in common. And I mean, not that I am a white person. I mean, that we both study whiteness in our research. So Missy is a white person. I am not a white person. And we come from those very different set of experiences to really think about that critically. And then obviously, when Alex joined and we told him, it's like, these are the things we still haven't talked on the podcast. Alex was like, yes, let's do that one. Let's talk about it.
It's an important question. I mean, I think, we are, I guess we'll say this in probably every podcast that we have, we're in extraordinary times. And I think when we're faced with, this amount of upheaval, asking questions like this will allow us to be a little bit more precise in how we move forward. And it's also just like the elephant in the room. I think for as long as I've been doing the EIB work, it has been this source of tension almost for a lot of people who aren't sure how to engage in this work in a way that is meaningful and engage in this work in a way that moves the needle when it comes to creating systemic change.
I totally agree. And I think, part of, Missy, what you said earlier, that sometimes people hear that they don't want white people there. The question is not, to do or to not to do it. Well, if you're not wanted in the space, it doesn't mean we don't want you to doing the work, period. Right. But it's also, as you mentioned, Alex, like a strategy point. Like, how do you do white allyship? Where do you do it? With whom do you do it? And it is intentional work. That means that you have to be self-aware of your identity, your power and privilege. We will talk about that. And ultimately, the goals you want to achieve. Who do you want to be in community with? And what is the most effective way you can use your own positioning to help advance the shared goals of your community?
And I'll also say that, when you're working to be an ally and you hear, we don't want you here, right, that can trigger like upset and defensiveness. And that's something also to recognize in yourself and to grapple with that to better understand why you're feeling that way. Because, you need to respect the spaces where your presence is going to make people feel uncomfortable, and that's part of good allyship, is being able to, not make yourself the center of what's happening.
Mm.
And what's the great anthropological term, cultural reflexivity? We have to examine how we show up, where we're coming from, how we may be perceived, and understand that our presence in certain situations may change the dynamic. And understanding that, I think, is crucial when we come to um, things like doing DEIB and social work at large, because the stakes are so high. We have to be able to be introspective. We have to be able to understand our role in things. One of my favorite things that I always say to myself is like, know your role. Like, what am I here to do? And also understand that there are a lot of there's going to be a lot of feelings about your presence here. But I think before we kind of dive into what, those feelings may be when white folks kind of engage in this work, I think it'd be helpful to talk a little bit about what exactly like allyship is, and also what is the difference between being an ally, an accomplice, and a co-conspirator. I think figuring out the differences and similarities between those things may help folks to understand how best they can engage in this kind of work.
Before we get there, you said something that I wanted to pick up on. Both of you did, like the elephant in the room. And I feel like we know that whiteness is something that is unmarked for white people, right? Oftentimes they don't even know or see themselves as white until they're being told you are a white person and put into a different positioning socially. So there is, to go back to your point about defensiveness, Missy, I feel like there is a defensiveness from white people where it says, aren't we all just people? Aren't we all just all the same? Right? Like, why should I be excluded from this conversation? Isn't the goal here to create equity? Why are you excluding me if you're trying to make equity and make everyone be equal? And I feel like that's a huge barrier. And I just, as you were both talking, it made me realize that before we go into the how do you become a white ally, we should address you are a white person. And that's part of accepting that is the first step towards being a white ally.
Right. And that the fact that, I'll do the linguistic thing, right? The fact that you don't have an adjective, right? You're not like, person is unmarked often, or American is unmarked in a certain way that indicates that like that's somehow the norm and it's hidden, right? It's not like Black American, it is not African American, it is not Caribbean American, right? So the fact that there's no adjective usually for white people is part of what you're saying, Lucy, that it's something that like becomes normative and is invisible to a lot of people, and was invisible to me when I was growing up. I didn't think about it at all, at all. And, to be able to start really thinking and categorizing in that way. And the other thing that I'll like elaborate on that I've been thinking about a lot is that that lack of really awareness and understanding is also part of why we see this changing kind of nature of even how we're thinking about discrimination right now. Right, is that any time that right, that a white person is excluded from the conversation, it's like discrimination, right? Because 99.9% of the time you're either setting the tone or you're not excluded. And that is something also, right? Grappling with that, and for folks to understand that can also help us understand what's wrong with talking about discrimination as exclusion for majority groups.
Mm-hmm.
That's that bit about, the adjectives, my hero, Toni Morrison, quoted her in the last podcast, gonna quote her again.
Mm-hmm.
She said, once America means white, everyone else has to hyphenate. And, that's 100% what Missy just kind of explained. And there is this notion that, you are the prototype, you are the beginning and end, and you have um, the full kind of monopoly on what it means to be American in a sense. And everyone else is just a visitor. And I think when the fact that white folks, so often don't have to confront their whiteness is also just, the definition of privilege, and it's the definition of whiteness. You do not have to. I think that for so many of us who are brown and black, indigenous, we're raised knowing that we were hyphenated. Um, and knowing that was a matter of survival. If we didn't know that, then, we find out really, really quickly. And I think when white folks start confronting the nature of whiteness, the construct of whiteness, I think that's where true racial healing really begins. Everyone in this country has racial trauma because the construct of race is a very, very traumatic thing. And if we are really truly to heal from it, then it requires that kind of cultural reflexivity and introspection.
Absolutely.
Can I ask an elephant in the room question to
For
both of you?
sure.
So I'm going to tell you the thing that I hear most frequently when we start having this discussion of whiteness and privilege. So I come from a working class community, a rural working class community. And the thing that I will hear most frequently is, but am I not marginalized too for the
Mm-hmm.
white working class? So
Yes.
how would you address that question if you got it?
Yeah. I mean, it's a yes and we get it all the time, all the time. So we hear that question too. That it's, you do a categorization on race, but you're also marginalized in other ways. So even though that whiteness gives you a privilege to be unmarked, to move up in the world in a way that people don't question things like your competency. If Missy and I, we talk about this. If you have an accent from the South, you're going to be assumed to be dumb. But here's your white privilege. You can practice getting rid of that accent, and then people will never know you're from the South. Right. And that's the difference between me. No matter how much I try to get rid of my Mexican accent, I will still look very different. I'm not going to be able to fully assimilate and become invisible. And that's part of the white privilege, that absolutely there is marginalization on different elements and different dimensions. So you could be a white man who is discriminated based on accent, based on socioeconomic background, based on lack of a college education. And that should motivate you to ally with people who also are discriminated and also understand that your whiteness gives you some kind of privilege. So it's complicated, right? It's not like a easy answer, but it means that you still have to be aware of that dimension. And if you really are committed to creating equity and change, that means that you have to recognize it in order to address a lot of these histories. And as Alex mentioned, racial trauma is traumatic for everyone.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
in the way that, we do have white dominance in this country. So a lot of it comes from, if we were to have a big umbrella, and I think about it in that way, if like the big umbrella is like white dominance, there's still a lot of different ways to think about privilege. Like Missy and I just did a keynote speech last week. And in it, like usually Missy talks about privilege because she's white. And then when we talk to white people, they're like, I get it now. Thank you, white person, for telling me about my white privilege. But this time, because of the content, I had to present that section. And so the way I said it was like, I have privilege based on citizenship. So I have a mixed status family. Some of my family doesn't have citizenship. Some of them don't have documentation. And that means that I have certain privileges and I could step up and be an ally to people without papers. I can offer to go to the grocery store for them. I can offer to do certain things for them when they're scared of ICE. I can put myself on the, picket line because I'm not afraid as much of getting deported, even though we see a lot of citizens getting deported right now. I'm tired of going to jail. That was in my youth, so I'm not going to do that right now. But it means having that awareness that you do have a different position in society and that position is complicated.
Yeah. And I wanted to throw that question out there because I think the lack of really addressing that question is part of the bigger tumult in the United States right now, is that like with, rural white working class folks is not addressing that question, or them like not really hearing those responses. And even asking the question itself comes from a place of privilege, right? Because if you're always, right, the unmarked form, then the moment that like this comes to the fore, then even asking the question becomes part of, right, the fact that you're the unmarked norm. But I think it's important to address that question. And I love the response, Lucy.
Yeah, I think too, there's this perception, and I think maybe, from my perspective, I think there's an insecurity, I think these days too, with around being white. When, you talked a little bit about Missy as well, like how when they're confronted with their whiteness, their, knee-jerk kind of reaction is to, oftentimes be defensive. And I think a lot of that is just because race is such a reductive construct in and of itself, and it doesn't really allow for the complexity of, what you were talking about, Missy, as well. I mean, Lucy as well. An example that I often use is my mother. I am a Black man who was adopted by white people, hence my very German last name, Bruggeman. And my mother is whitest of white from Austin, Minnesota, the hometown of Spam. It's where Spam was created. There's the Spam Museum there, so it doesn't get much whiter than that. And yeah. And, I struggled a lot growing up because I don't think my mom had awareness of her whiteness in the way that I was aware of her whiteness. And I was very patently aware of how I was being treated differently, not necessarily by her, but by society. And it took a lot of healing between my mother and her having to confront her whiteness in order for us to really, build a relationship that was able to move beyond these kind of barriers that we were placed in arbitrarily often. So it requires, I think, a lot of folks to just be brave when confronting these privileges, their state, their kind of status, their in society. And one thing that I really want to, kind of share is that it's always worth it to confront these things. Nothing but good can come from confronting one's privilege, whether you're white, whether you're a Black man, whether you have whatever privilege you may possess. Confront it, own up to it, embrace it, and then do something with it.
Yeah, and it wasn't until I can honestly say it wasn't until I got almost to grad school and into grad school that I was not really, right. I didn't have to confront anything. I didn't really have to at all. And it was getting into anthropology that helped me like deconstruct and better understand identities and privileges. And that's in part why we are trying to use anthropology to help other people do that as well, because it's a beautiful set of tools for really better understanding the different ways that you have privilege and power and the different identities that you have and the different kinds of roles that you inhabit. And rather than getting defensive about something that's static, right, you're always changing. So think about, right, the things that you can change and that you can't, and how those things give you leverage in different situations.
And we all remember that nice article, the Nasi Rema.
Oh yeah.
It's just like mind blowing for a first intro class to anthropology. We'll put it in the show notes. If you have not read it, you'll find it very interesting, and then try to figure out what culture that's written about.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about like the allyship, accomplices, and co-conspirators.
Yeah.
I think what is important to understand that it's, this is all a spectrum. Allies are often kind of can be kind of perceived as being passive. It's also like kind of can be perceived as doing the bare minimum of work and supporting vulnerable and marginalized community. Oftentimes there's not a lot of risk to it. And oftentimes there's benefit to it. Accomplices, I think, though, move beyond that verbal kind of tacit support and take a little bit more action and disrupt those harmful systems. Whereas co-conspirators, they're active, they help carry the burden, and they use their privilege, like we kind of just talked about, to create change for those communities, and often at great risk to themselves. So I guess a question to both of you is, where do white folks who practice DEIB fall on that spectrum?
Ooh, that's a good question.
It's a good question. And I had heard these terms before about accomplices and co-conspirators, but not as detailed as you outlined it. So I appreciate that you defined it so granularly. Is that a word, granularly?
It is now.
It is. Thank you.
Yeah.
There were a few episodes where I kept messing up words one after the other, and then that became a running joke. So maybe we'll get back to that. But I think it depends on the level of engagement you have with DEI. Like, you can be an accomplice in DEI and you can be a co-conspirator. And I like the way that you defined it, Alex, that it was like based on what level of risk are you taking? And based on like, what are you getting? Are you getting something out of it? Or is there more harm than good that you could be exposing yourself to? And I have seen white allies across that spectrum when it comes to DEI. Like, for example, we have a client who I would say is an accomplice because they're not speaking out in terms of DEI, and they're trying to maintain their contracts, and they're trying to be in self-preservation mode, right? And even though I know that we can reach out to them and they give us opportunities and they're still continuing the broader fight of DEI, it's a really self-preservation mindset. And so I would consider that an accomplice. And then we have co-conspirator clients who are like, yeah, like down with Trump, and who are actively, trying to disrupt that, even though that could create a lot of risk to their business. They're just like, bring it on. So I feel like it just depends on how you're engaging. But I don't see either as good or bad, right? Like, I feel like if you're engaging, it's good. If you're getting benefit from it, then I feel like it's part of the system, I don't know.
I would agree with the, like, in terms of DEI, I think in this moment in particular, that there are definitely, if we think about it in terms of organizations, there are some organizations that are definitely willing to take on a lot of risk and help carry the burden, right? And but I would say they are, well, I say a lot, but they're far fewer than they should be in this moment, because the more co-conspirators you have, the more collectivity that you have. And that's really how we think about system change is, we've got to have, a collective group working together. So I wish there were more co-conspirators. I appreciate every co-conspirator that we've encountered in the DEIB space. But I feel like in this moment, there aren't enough of them.
Yeah. And it's funny, our minds just made that shift to organizations are white. And so we consider them white allies.
Oh, yeah. Well, they're white people.
Yeah. So we just wanted to clarify that point.
Yes, the corporations are people according to the law. So we obviously made them people in our head, and they are totally white people. They are certainly most definitely.
Yeah. I think too, like what's interesting is that it's hard to define white folks who practice DEIB as allies, because it is, from the definitions that I gave, because it is their allyship is passive, where this work is not passive. It is about disruption at the end of the day, and it is about creating new systems and bringing in folks from communities who have not had equitable opportunities. And, but co-conspiratorship is, like you said, it is rare. And I think a lot of that has to do with also that this is just capitalism as well. Mm-hmm. And, can you be a co-conspirator when we are also perpetuating a system like capitalism that perpetuates inequity at its core? But it's not necessarily a bad thing. Like Lucy said, none of these are bad things. And, it requires this spectrum if we're going to move the needle anyway.
Yeah. And I would say something. Oh, sorry.
Should I go? I'll do it. I'll do it. Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
I think because what Alex said really resonated with me, because I say this all the time when I'm talking about like activist work in general, is that like, and I think we picked this up in the resilience talk too, but like, you cannot do everything, right? You cannot do everything. We do this as a collective, and we all have different roles to play in doing this work. And so, where you're at and what you're able to do based on who you are and the capacity that you have in this moment, like, we're all working as a collective. I keep reminding people of that right now too, because I think there are a lot of people that are trying to fight back on every front right now, and that's not healthy and it's not actually effective. And so when we're thinking of allyship too, right, that's just to reiterate, it's not a bad thing necessarily to be where you're at, but understand where you're at. And if you aspire to be a co-conspirator, then you're going to need to move in a different direction.
And I would say the co-conspirator bar is so high. Like, it's just high, right? So one of my heroes of all time is a white abolitionist named John Brown. And Du Bois wrote about him extensively. Like, I think he wrote one of his biographies. And John Brown was a white man in the abolitionist times who was very against slavery, who led raids, who wanted to arm the slaves, who like massacred and killed like slave owners. And to me, that's like the highest epitome of what a co-conspirator is willing to sacrifice your life for the cause. I know not everyone thinks that way, but ultimately he was like killed, like he was, put on trial and was assassinated or etc. As I'm trying to narrate this history that I learned a long time ago. But, I went to UC Berkeley during the time of there was a huge fee hike and there were a lot of social protests. And there were a lot of white allies in those movements. And we were having these kinds of conversations because there were a lot of really well-intentioned white people who went to Berkeley because they loved the history, right? The political activism, they loved getting involved and fighting for the cause. And a lot of white allies that didn't understand themselves as being white. Like they wanted to do good things, but their tactics, they would be also extreme, like John Brown's tactics, but they weren't murdering anyone. But, they were like occupying buildings, like getting confrontations with the police. And while ideally, I would say John Brown is a hero in what he was doing, there's also like political context and historical context. So when we're thinking about the abolitionist time, I feel like it was really hard to pretend that you didn't know you were white, right? And even during the civil rights movement, because you literally had signs that said white people only and like Black people only. So your whiteness was always confronted all the time in a positive, reaffirming way. And when it comes to doing social activism and social justice work, that's like one of the challenges that need to be overcome. But it's like, how do you strategically do it in a way that truly advances the cause is something that is always in conversation with the people that you want to ally yourself with. So I guess the reason why I counterpose these two things is because I think, yes, we want the co-conspirator bar is so high, but it's also something that should always be in conversation. Like, what do you want out of my white privilege and how can I support you? And I have seen that in, and I guess the closest thing I can think about that is more like a John Brown tactic is when there's police riots that show up at a protest that literally white people will hold hands together and form a block to protect everyone else. And there will be a line of white people between the cops and everyone else. And I think that's such a beautiful sign of solidarity because one, if cops hit a white person, it's most likely to be all over the news and there will be outrage and there'll be, complaints versus if it's a brown person getting hit by the cops, if it's, a George Floyd getting hit by the cops, like the bar of what it takes to be on the news and saying this is police brutality is so much higher when you're a brown person and a Black person than when you're a white person. Right. And so I think, not saying that, maybe I am saying that. I think a lot of people in DEI have had that kind of history with social justice activism. And when I was doing my fieldwork research on diversity management, tons of pioneers that started the field told me stories about marching with Martin Luther King Jr. So there is this like strong contingent in DEI that is so passionate about social justice. And so these worlds now are colliding more frontally, whereas for a couple of decades, we were just like DEI is only in the professional space. But now as we're seeing more and more protests and more alignment since George Floyd with the social world, I think it's important to think about now going full circle to what Alex mentioned earlier, to really think of that as a spectrum. Like you have this accomplice role you can take, you have a co-conspirator role, but between those two things, there's so many things you can do. You can advocate as a leader as a manager, you can advocate for people who are more marginalized to get more opportunities, right? That seems like an accomplice role because you're not really risking much. You're providing opportunities and helping people with their career development, or you can literally be in the front lines helping people not get deported right now. Like those are, really wide range of roles that white people can take.
Yeah, and I think, what I like that you are kind of bringing in, especially that historical kind of perspective, because what I want folks to understand is that DEI work obviously doesn't exist within a vacuum, and it is very much a part of a lineage of civil rights work. Like you said, Lucy, a lot of the people who, you know, the founders of DEI, the kind of intellectual and philosophical architects of it, they got their start marching alongside Martin Luther King. And we can't divorce DEI from that lineage at all. So when white folks are engaging in this work, to me, they're engaging in the extension, this modern extension of the civil rights movement. And sure, right now, where black folks are not having milkshakes poured on their head in all white lunch counter, but that doesn't also mean that black folks are being silenced in the boardroom.
Right.
And DEI, I think, inherently is a form of disrupting that kind of white only sphere, and it's doing so in a way that um, is isn't seeking to make other people destitute. It's seeking to actually, again, build that coalition that folks like Martin Luther King talked about. And if we take the examples of history and we think about them, things like the Freedom Riders, folks who, you know, went down to Louisiana and Mississippi to, desegregate spaces. One of my favorite, I guess, co-conspirators is a woman named Joan Trumpauer Mulholland, and she was a white woman. Her great grandparents were slave owners, and what she did. She basically dropped out of Duke University. She started hanging around Howard University, my alma mater, and she um, got aligned with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, alongside folks like Stokely Carmichael. Um, and she was arrested. She was thrown into prison, and she sacrificed her entire life and also her entire kind of heritage in order to stand up for something right now. Obviously, white folks who are doing DEIB, the stakes might not be as high. They're not going to have to, ride down and be thrown in prison. I mean, yeah, it's DEI is and public enemy number one. So hopefully it doesn't get to that point. But if it does, we also have, that historical context and those stories to kind of guide our way. And I think white folks who engage in this work, them understanding that this is part of that lineage of resistance, of disruption, of imagining a world that is more equitable. You know, that is what should draw them in.
Right. I agree. And I think that also, we're talking about like putting your body right on the line and putting right like your family connections, right? All of those things on the line. And I think that, again, I'll reiterate too that like one of the things that I think that white folks really have, especially in these kinds of spaces doing DEIB work, is that you have the access already that like you can think of disruption in a different way, right? You can think of disruption as real change. And that does have maybe not bodily risk, maybe it has economic risk, maybe it has risk for your career trajectory, which also impacts your ability, right, to like survive, because we do live in a capitalist system. And that, like, you know, that is also something to consider, that like you have access to those spaces, therefore you can do the metaphorical burning it down from the inside. And that is a kind of allyship work as well that fits in with that lineage, maybe a little less flamboyant, but necessary if we're thinking about that kind of systemic change.
Yeah.
And I think like too, like the fact that the risks are not as dire as they were back then is also proof that we have come a long way.
Mhm.
Not nearly far enough, definitely not far enough. But the fact that you know these the integration of the business class is not resulting in fines, death, lynchings, or anything like that means that society has come far enough that there's not that kind of risk associated. But again, there's a whole lot more that needs to be done, and a whole lot more um, co-conspiratorship needed within the business class in order for those these strides to really take root in the way that they should and need to.
So I have a couple observations. One, it's really funny that we just walked everyone through like, here's how you can be the best ally by putting your body on the line and getting murdered. I'm just kidding. You don't need to do that. But like, even I have spoken about this many times, like I do feel like I owe how far I've come in my career, having a PhD, starting a business, to white allies. And they have been instrumental from the time I showed up at Berkeley. I think I've said this before, but when I got accepted, so I was valedictorian of my high school. And I do not come from a family that went to college. So when I was accepted into Berkeley on a full ride, I had no idea how to pronounce Berkeley. I looked at the words on the paper and I'm just like, how do you Berkeley? Because with the Y at the end, that threw me off linguistically. But I showed up at Berkeley and I was completely lost. Like I had no idea what to do, what classes to take, what I was going to graduate in. I just knew I showed up and I started taking courses like haphazardly and then realized that none of them were helping me towards the actual major. I ended up dropping out after a semester because I was so overwhelmed. And then when I went back and I started connecting to organizations that were for students of color, one of the first mentors I got was a old white man who used to be the director of the Phoebe Hearst Museum. And then he started a program in Peru to called in partnership with the Minority Health Institute of Research Training, something like that. It was a while ago. And he helped me write my application to the program. He line edited. He was one of the people that was reviewing all these applications. And he was like, no, your application is not going to get you in. And we met once a week until the application was due. So he could basically edit my application for me because he saw potential in me and was like, you should do this program. And then I got into the program. And then after that, I feel like it was just like white ally after white ally because most of the faculty at UC Berkeley were white. So it's like we have this lineage of white privilege that really could be used for the better of people. And I think this goes back to what you're all talking about using it for good. Like if you're a white person that has ever mentored anyone, to me, that's DEI work. Because that's one of the things that DEI work is, right? It's mentorship and sponsorship and coaching. So if you've ever mentored anyone, that to me is like you've already been doing the work and you could continue to do it better. But the other thing that I wanted to throw a wrench in things is that as we have more DEI professions, we have now chief diversity officers who, in some ways are disappearing. This has come up before. Can a white person hold a chief diversity officer role? Now, Missy, you asked the hard question. Now I'm asking the group the hard question. Like, what do you think about that?
I think that's a hard question. I think, for starters, DEI wasn't just a sociocultural movement that, especially gained steam after, the lynching of George Floyd. What that did was open up um, economic and employment opportunities for thousands upon thousands and thousands of brown and black people. So a part of me is like, well, we want, brown and black faces in these, positions, but it also, I'm reminded of, I think one of the smartest minds out there right now, something that Ruha Benjamin said, black faces in high spaces won't save you.
Mm.
So, when we're thinking about what work needs to be done, we need to ask who is going to do the work the best too. And oftentimes, that's a black person or a brown person or, someone who comes from a historically and presently marginalized group. But if there's like a John Brown type character, then absolutely. And I think that we have to analyze and think about what this work is designed to do, what it's supposed to do, not necessarily who is doing it.
Mm.
And I think that, early on in my DEI career, I probably would have said like, no, a white person should not do that.
Mm.
Now, I would say, maybe, okay, sure. How are you gonna, turn this into Harper's Ferry like John Brown did?
Mm.
How are you using your privilege and your power fundamentally changing the course of history for this institution, for this organization? And like we've stated before, in order for systems to change, then it requires participation from people from multiple different backgrounds. And, I would love to see it because at the end of the day, the goal is for these systems to change. So I would say I'm cool with it, depending on who it is.
Yeah, I think that this is a good question because I think this is like part of the inherent tension that we're talking about. So I'll just kind of reflect back some of I think what Alex is saying is that, right, it's absolutely critical to center the voices and the economic opportunities of people who have been historically marginalized. And that's really important. But the thing that we haven't really addressed yet is also the fact that, like, there's a lot of emotional and other kinds of labor and often uncompensated labor that is foisted upon right, marginalized people, right, people of color in doing this work. And so in thinking about like, holding those positions, I think there needs to be a balance there. I think there also needs to be a balance in terms of thinking about like what the chief diversity officer is being asked to do, and whether or not the person being put in that position, whoever it is, has the training and the skill sets needed to do it. And that is because a lot of people that, like, in the explosion of DEI, got picked out of a crowd to do this work uncompensated or very little compensation, and without actually being trained up to do it in a way that's impactful. And then when it doesn't work, then someone in the organization is like, oh, see, DEI doesn't work. Right. And so that itself, right, creates like a feedback loop that's really problematic. So I think that's like, there's a lot of tensions going on. And it's a really good question, Lucy, because like we want representation, right? Like that is the point here, is to like, please make these organizations less white. But I think there are a lot of different, tensions to think about, and like simply stepping back and being able to navigate those, right? And really being able to think about those, right? The person that does that is the person that I want to be my chief diversity officer.
Yeah. And
Absolutely.
I love both of your responses. And it makes me think that, when the Twitter, well, before, when X was Twitter,
Oh no,
one
it's
other,
always Twitter. I'm sorry. Like I'm reclaiming that. I am not using X. No.
yeah, before, what's his face, who should not be named, claimed Twitter. The chief diversity officer was a gay white man. And I remember there was this huge uproar about it from DEI professionals, from people of color who were outraged. It's like, why would you appoint a white person to do the job when, this role, to your point, Alex, has been a way to give people of color opportunities in high level positions? But I have to agree with what everyone's saying. But it does make me think that we also have a lot of work to do for people of color themselves and marginalized groups to think this way, because I don't think that's the common way of thinking right now of, yes, as long as the person is competent and is helping us achieve the goals. I think a lot of people would have these kinds of reactions and say, no, they shouldn't be white people. So going back to your original question to Missy about like what happens when you're told, no, you can't do this work. I think if you are in that kind of role and you're told you should not have your job because you're a white person, I think that would be really hard, emotionally, psychologically, socially, etc. And it's not the kind of thing where it's like, okay, let me just go find another job, because that's really hard to find. So I get it. And I guess what I would say to my own question is to find your community. To find the people, my advisor from grad school used to say this, to find your fellow travelers and find the people who get it. And both, white allies and non-white marginalized people who are there to support you. Because when you're having these hard existential questions that you're grappling with, it is just so good to be in community with others. And I think that is something that can help continue be an ally in the best way possible.
Absolutely. And I think too, we've talked about this, extensively, is that this work is not necessarily like the long-term solution. It is something that, in a much better world, it shouldn't even exist. The fact that it does is, in my mind, a little dystopian. I always think it's like, I always like wonder what my ancestors who were enslaved would say. Like, you get paid oftentimes when, if you're in higher level of DEI, upwards of six figures to tell white folks that racism is bad.
That is my best job. Yeah, I love that.
it's absurd. And like, I wonder, like, I wish I could see their, my ancestors' facial expressions when I tell them that. But this work is not a long-term solution. it is something that, I think the three of us have all decided is like, we know we have done a great job when we're no longer needed, when it's no longer necessary for us to be in these positions because the mechanisms and the structure and the organization itself is kind of, working symbiotically enough that things like inequity aren't present. And, that is the goal, I think, for just like a lot of larger social movements and just I think for a lot of people and what we want this world to be. We don't want to have to be fighting for this stuff.
No.
We
Mm-mm.
shouldn't have to be fighting for this stuff. So when we're thinking about, white folks who are doing this work, I ask, that they keep that in mind is that you are here to make sure that no one has to do this work ever again in the future. Hopefully, not in 50 years, hopefully in 10 years, this work isn't necessary. So, when we're thinking about this as a career choice, that might not be the most, stable thing, just like, oh, well, I'm going to be like unemployed in like 5, 10 years. But again, the point of DEI work and the lineage from which it comes is about change, and it is about growing beyond our kind of, the limitations that we've been placed within. And it's also just about being better humans to each other. So, and work and being and working, what am I trying to say? Working on something that's bigger than ourselves.
Yeah. And I think that, I'll go more logistics and brass tacks and just also say that like white people, right? I love the job description. It's like telling white folks that racism is bad. And, like hearkening back to an earlier point with Lucy and I, it's like usually I'm the one that does that in a room full of white people. And you absolutely, right, sometimes need to have a white person tell other white people about their story of trying for their whole life to unlearn racism, right? And that can be very powerful and sometimes is more powerful or allows certain audiences to hear it. And so there is definitely, right, a need for that and a role for that, but you have to do the work, white people, right? You have to do the work, and you are never going to be done doing the work. You are going to keep doing the work because this is a very big system that it will like pop up somewhere in something that like you think or do or say for a very long time, right? The rest of your life. So, but I do think that can be a really powerful, like strategic thing to have white people doing this work for that reason too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked, and I think we spoke the other day about this, and thinking about this podcast is like, is it the responsibility of marginalized people to change systems that they didn't create? And, I think our answer to that was like, sometimes, partly yes and no. I think that, you know, especially for marginalized folks, like we do want to change these things and we don't want to just like lay down and let other people change them for us because that doesn't, we're still not centered in that. But to your point, Missy, like white folks need to talk to white folks to change the systems that they benefit from, their ancestors have benefited from. And there needs to be a coalition of folks who are not laying down and letting other people change these systems or revert them back to these kind of antiquated understandings of humanity. So it's all hands on deck.
Agreed. And we are out of time.
And that's a beautiful way to end, though.
Yeah, I really
all
like
hands
that.
on deck.
And I also really, we could talk forever about this because this is what we live and breathe when we think about doing DEI work. So if you have any unanswered questions and you want us to do a follow-up podcast episode on those questions, let us know. We're happy to continue the conversation.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Alex. And we will not see you. You will all hear us again sometime soon.